Hello everybody, welcome into another lesson. So today we are going to talk about congruent triangles. When we have congruent triangles, that means that all their sides are congruent to each other and all the angles are congruent to each other. So you have the tick marks here on each sides of the triangle. The one on the one triangle where you have one tick mark, that corresponds to the side that has one tick mark on the other side, on the other triangle. Where you have 2 on the first triangle, that corresponds to 2 on the second triangle. Where you have 3 on the first triangle, that corresponds to 3 on the second triangle. And then we should be familiar with the angle congruency markers already. The 1 arc, the 2 arc, the 3 arc, the 1 arc corresponds to the 1 arc on the second triangle. The 2 arc on the first triangle corresponds to the 2 arc on the second. The 3 arc corresponds to the 3 arc on the second. So we have congruent triangles here. So you're going to learn something called CPCTC. And we will definitely talk more about this in geometry when we talk about triangles. But this stands for corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. CPCTC. This will be used a lot in geometry when we do proofs. When we talk about doing proofs of theorems. Which we're not going to do in this course, but in geometry there will be a lot of proof. And this corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. This is used big time in geometry for doing proofs. So keep CPCTC in mind. Corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. So we have 2 congruent triangles here. We need to figure out which sides are congruent to each other and then which angles are congruent to each other. Let's start with the 1 tick mark. We have side DE, so I'm going to do this here. We have side DE. This line above it stands for line segment DE because this is a line segment from D to E. That is congruent to line segment PR on the right triangle. So as you see, line segment DE on the first triangle, the left one, is congruent to line segment PR because they both have the 1 tick mark. What else? Let's go for the 2 tick marks. So that means line segment DF. Line segment DF is congruent to, let's find the 2 tick marks on this triangle, line segment PQ. Alright, then last but not least, let's go for the 3 tick marks. We got EF. So line segment EF is congruent to line segment RQ. Or you could put QR, however you want to put it. It's congruent to line segment RQ. So now we've identified our congruent sides of the triangle. Let's identify the congruent angles. Start with the 1 arc. We have angle F. Angle F is congruent to, on this triangle, we have the 1 arc on angle Q, is congruent to angle Q. And then what else? Start with the 2 arcs. So angle E on the first triangle is congruent to angle R on the second triangle. And then we have the 3 arcs. Well, you got angle D is congruent to angle P on the second triangle. So we've identified congruent sides. We got DE is congruent to PR. We got DF is congruent to PQ. And then we got EF is congruent to RQ. For angles, we have angle F is congruent to angle Q. We have angle E is congruent to angle R. Then we have angle D is congruent to angle P. So we've identified sides and angles. So now we can go through finally and we can say triangle DEF is congruent to triangle what? Triangle DEF is congruent to what? Which triangle? Well, it starts D, E, and F. You notice it goes from one tick mark on this side, then to connect the other side, it goes to 3 tick marks. You want to start in the same order for the second triangle. So start where there's 1 tick mark. It would be PRQ. It would be PRQ. You want to go in the same order for both triangles. So triangle DEF is congruent to triangle PRQ because on the left triangle starts on the side with 1 tick mark, ends on the side with 3 tick marks. So you're going to do the same thing with the second triangle. Start where there's 1 tick mark, end on the side with 3 tick marks. That's how we get triangle DEF is congruent to triangle PRQ. And I got more examples here. I'm going to leave that CPCTC up there. That does come in handy. Now, when we get into geometry, we'll learn methods for telling how triangles are congruent. There's a lot of methods to tell it. We're not going to do it in this course, but we will in geometry. Actually, I think we got CPCTC. All right. So we got 2 triangles that look like this. Let's see here. We have a right angle here. This is vertex K. The end point here, the points where you see the letters, those are called the vertices, the vertex. Where you see the corners that's called the vertex. Another right angle at N. Alright, let's see. What's congruent here? This side is congruent to this side. We got 2 arcs here, 2 arcs here. Alright. 3 tick marks here, 3 tick marks here. And then each of these angles are congruent to each other. We got 2 tick marks on each of these. Okay. Alright, we've set up our 2 congruent triangles here. So, both of these triangles that are formed, where they both meet at M, they're both congruent triangles. So, we need to figure out which sides. Let's start with which sides are congruent to which. Okay. You have side KJ with 1 tick mark. So let's start with the 1 tick mark. We got side KJ is congruent to, it looks like, side NP. Looks like it's congruent to side NP. So side KJ is congruent to side NP because they both have the 1 tick mark. Alright, let's start with the 2 tick marks. It looks like side KM is congruent to side NM. So it looks like side KM is congruent to side NM. Then let's start with the 3 tick marks. Looks like side JM is congruent to side PM. So far for congruent sides, we got KJ congruent to NP. We have KM congruent to NM. And then we have JM congruent to PM right here. Just follow the tick marks. You'll see 1 corresponds to 1, 2 corresponds to 2, 3 corresponds to 3. So we got the sides. Now let's look for angles. Well, I think it's obvious K and N are both congruent because they're both right angles. So angle K is definitely congruent to angle N because they're both right angles. Now let's start with the 1 tick mark. Well, these both meet at M. If you want to form an angle wherever you have 2 angles meet at a certain point, they can't both be angle M. What you're going to do is take where you see you have 2 line segments here that form that angle, that form this angle and form this angle. You go to the start of the line segment, which would be K. So you'd have KMJ. You would have angle KMJ because K starts the angle, it goes to M, then it ends at J. So you'd have angle KMJ because it starts at K, goes to M, and it ends at J. Well, there's going to be a similar setup on the right side. You're going to have angle NMP because here the line segment that forms the angle starts at N, goes to M, and ends at P. So you'll have angle NMP. So angle KMJ is congruent to angle NMP because these can't both be angle M. And then of course we got the 2 arc marks. Angle J is congruent to angle P. So if you just have an angle at one point, one vertex, you can just use that letter to name the angle. But if you have multiple angles meeting at the same point, you want to, because the angle is formed again by 2 line segments. It's formed by KM and MJ. It's formed by those 2 line segments coming together. So it'll be angle KMJ. It'll be angle NMP on this side because the line segments NM and MP come together to form this angle. So that's why we split it up into, that's why we have a 3-letter name for the angles. But we've identified congruent sides, we've identified congruent angles. Now we need to identify the congruent triangles. So we can start by saying triangle KJM is congruent to triangle what? What's it congruent to? Well, again, start with your tick marks. KJM, it starts with 1 tick mark and then it ends on the side with 3 tick marks. So you're going to do the same thing over here. It'd be NPM. Because it would start over here with 1 tick mark and on the side with 3 tick marks. So it's congruent to triangle NPM. So triangle KJM is congruent to triangle NPM. Because you want to start in the same place on both triangles and end in the same place. That's how you get the name of your triangle right. Alright, I got 2 more examples for this lesson. Alright, what's next? All right. We just set this triangle up here. Alright, so we have two more congruent triangles here. So again, go with your tick marks on each of these two congruent triangles. Let's start with our sides. What sides are congruent? Let's start with the one tick marks here. Looks like we got AB. So we got line segment AB, side AB, is congruent to side CB. So AB is congruent to CB. What else? Let's start with our two tick marks. Looks like we got side DB. So side DB is congruent to side EB. Then last but not least, let's start with our three tick marks. Looks like AD is congruent to CE. Alright, so we got, so far for sides congruent, all the sides we got, AB is congruent to CB. DB is congruent to EB, and then AD is congruent to CE. We got our congruent sides. Now let's get our congruent angles. Let's start with the one tick marks. Interesting thing here, where you see B at, these two angles here, you can actually use the fact that vertical angles are congruent. Which, if we were doing the geometry course, we would probably use that in our proof. But because you have two intersecting lines here that just create a vertical angles, remember from yesterday's lesson, we could use the fact that vertical angles are congruent. But that's just a side note. So, again, these both here cannot be angle B, because then it's going to be like, which angle are you talking about at point B? You want to start, again, whenever you have more than one angle meet, you want to start with the line segments that create the angle. So line segments AB and then BD, those create the angle. So for the angle, you'll start at point A, because that's where it starts. It comes together with the other line segment at B, and then it ends at D. So angle ABD, this is angle ABD here, this angle is, because it starts at A, goes to B, and then ends at D. That's where the two line segments come together. This is congruent to angle CBE. It starts at C, goes to B, ends at E. Whoops, let me draw the angle symbol. This is congruent to angle CBE. So ABD is congruent to angle CBE. Okay? So, because line segment CB and line segments BE join at the angle here. So that's how you do it. Starts at C, goes to B, ends at E. That's how you get angle CBE. since you have more than one angle at that point. Now the rest, let's do the 2 tick marks. Angle A is congruent to the 2 tick marks at angle C, so angle A is congruent to angle C. Then the 3 tick marks, angle D is congruent to angle E with the 3 tick marks there. Alright, so we've identified our congruent sides, we've identified our congruent angles. Let's identify the congruent triangle now. So, if we're to do this here, triangle DBA is congruent to triangle what? Alright, so let's see. DBA. So this time, it starts on the side with 2 tick marks, ends on the side with 1. So this would be, if it starts on the side with 2 tick marks, ends on the side with 1, we're going to have to do that with the other triangle. That would be EBC. It would be congruent to triangle EBC. So triangle DBA is congruent to triangle EBC. That's what we would get. Because you want to start in the same place on both triangles to properly label which triangle it is. That way you get the correct corresponding congruent parts. And I got one more example here. Alright. Back to a more normal one. Now let's do it a little bit lower, eh? Alright. And we got RST. Alright, we have 2 congruent triangles, but they look a bit distorted from each other. So, again, let's find all the congruent parts of each triangle. So, start with your 1 tick mark to find your congruent sides. Looks like WY, so it looks like side WY, line segment WY, is congruent to line segment TR. It's congruent to TR. Okay, so we've identified WY being congruent to TR. Let's start with the 2 tick marks. So it looks like ZY is congruent to SR. Yeah, so it looks like line segment ZY is congruent to line segment SR. Now there's one more side to find. Okay, so we got WZ. So it looks like line segment WZ is congruent to TS. Alright, so we've identified the three congruent sides of each triangle. It looks like WY is congruent to TR, ZY is congruent to SR, and WZ is congruent to TS. Now let's identify congruent angles. Well, let's start with the one arc. Looks like angle Y is congruent to the other one arc. Looks like angle R. So it looks like angle Y is congruent to angle R. Let's go for the two arc marks. It looks like angle W is congruent to the other two arc marks, angle T. So angle W is congruent to angle T. And then you have the three arc marks. It looks like angle Z is congruent to the other three arc marks, angle S. Oh, as a side note, whenever you're doing algebra, be careful about using the letter Z because it can look like 2. Make sure you draw a line through the middle of Z like I have here so it doesn't get mixed up with the number 2. And S, just be careful using that because it can look like a 5. That's why I use the cursive letter S oftentimes. But that's a side note. So anyway, we've identified the three congruent angles also, as well as the three congruent sides. Now we need to identify the congruent triangles. Alright, so we have triangle ZWY is congruent to triangle what? Well, ZWY. So we want to start in the same place for the other triangle. It starts on the side with the 3 tick marks, ends on the side with 1. So that means we need to start on this triangle the same side. Start on the side with 3 tick marks, end on the side with 1. So it looks like it'd be triangle STR. So it looks to be that triangle ZWY is congruent to triangle STR. Is what we would get. Okay. So, again, whenever you have congruent triangles, remember CPCTC. Corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. What that means is, where you see the 1 tick mark on each triangle, that means those sides are congruent on each triangle. The 2 tick marks correspond to the 2 tick marks on the other. The 3 tick marks correspond to the 3 tick marks on the other. Those are called congruency markers. Those show you which sides correspond to which and which sides are congruent to which on each triangle. Same with the arc marks and the angles. 1 arc mark corresponds to 1 arc mark, 2 arc marks corresponds to 2 arc marks, 3 arc marks corresponds to 3 arc marks. Those show you which angles are congruent to each other. Then, once you've found all your congruent pieces of said triangles, what you want to do is form which triangle is congruent to which in the end. The order was ZWY. You always start in the same place on each triangle to label it properly so you get the congruent pieces and parts. So if it starts on the side, for example, with 3 tick marks and ends on the side with 1 on one triangle, you're going to want to do the same thing on the next triangle. You'll want to go in that letter order to get your proper letter order for the next triangle. So really, that's all there is to congruent triangles. So the next lesson, we're going to talk about transformations in the coordinate plane, such as shifting objects, such as stretching them, shrinking them, reflecting them. It's going to be a pretty neat lesson, the next lesson. So stay tuned for that. Hope everyone has a good night. Take care.